After my husband's death, I found a marriage contract in which my name was not mentioned. My husband had betrayed me and transferred everything to his mistress. But I did not give up. The house has never felt this quiet before. Not in all the years I've lived here. Even when the children were grown and gone, even when Patrick traveled for business, even when I stayed up late with only the ticking of the hall clock for company, there was always something alive in the walls. A warmth, a hum, a presence. But now, after his death, silence has a weight to it. It presses down on me like a heavy quilt I can't push away. I walk from room to room and the emptiness follows me, clinging to my heels. I used to think I knew this house by heart, the creak in the third stair, the way the afternoon light fell across the parlor rug. But lately it feels like I've been set down inside a stranger's home. Everything looks the same, yet everything has changed. To keep from losing myself completely, I clean. It's what my hands know how to do. If I stay still too long, the tears start, and they don't come in pretty little drops. They come in floods that leave me shaking, empty, unable to breathe. So I polish. I dust. I open closets and drawers, letting my fingers linger on the things that still smell faintly of him. In the hall closet hangs his old overcoat, the one he wore every winter for 20 years. The sleeves are shiny at the elbows, the lining patched by my own hand, but I can't bear to move it. When I press my face into the wool, there's still the faintest trace of his aftershave, spicy and sharp, a scent that once clung to his shirts when he kissed me goodnight. I hold on to it as though it can tether him back to me. The kitchen is no better. His favorite mug still sits in the cupboard, chipped at the rim where he always drank his morning coffee. I catch myself reaching for it when I make tea, but I set it back almost reverently, as though to use it would erase the last of him. The refrigerator hums like it always did, but when I open it, the sight of only my small portions feels wrong, like the house is shrinking around me. I wander into his study more often than I should. It still smells of pipe tobacco, though he hadn't smoked in years. The books line the shelves neatly, each one exactly where he left it. Sometimes I run my hand along the spines, whispering the titles out loud, as though my voice might coax his laughter from the shadows. The chair behind the desk still carries the imprint of his body, a sagging in the leather that no one else could ever fill. At night, the bed is the cruelest reminder. I try to sleep on my side, only leaving his half untouched, but sometimes in the small hours, I reach across the sheets and find only cold emptiness. I wake with a start, thinking I've heard him call my name, only to find the house wrapped in silence. The neighbors came by the first few days. Pies, casseroles, murmured condolences, but eventually the doorbell stopped ringing. Life moves on for everyone else. For me it has stalled. I sit at the kitchen table with a lukewarm cup of tea, staring at the garden where we once planted roses together. The blooms are wild now, climbing in every direction, and I feel guilty for letting them go, though truthfully, I don't have the heart to tame them without him. Sometimes I catch myself talking out loud to him, my voice echoing off the walls. I tell him about the weather, about the neighbor's new dog, about how quiet supper feels when you're only cooking for one. I ask him why he had to leave, though I know no answer will ever come. It's strange, the little things that undo me. A pair of reading glasses left on the nightstand. A book he never finished, his bookmark still halfway through the chapter. The shoes lined up by the door, as if he'll be coming home any moment. I can't move them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I sweep the floors, I wash the curtains. I open every window to let in the August breeze. But the house still feels cold, as though some unseen hand has stolen away its heart. For the first time I feel like a guest in my own home, tiptoeing around memories that sting like open wounds. Every evening when the sun sinks low, I wander from room to room, touching things that once belonged to him. The photo albums, the cufflinks in the top drawer, the cracked leather wallet he carried until the day he died. Each item is a thread, and I cling to them all, afraid that if I let go, he'll vanish completely. Grief, I've learned, isn't loud. It doesn't come with wails or storms. It settles in quietly, filling corners with shadows, making even the brightest rooms feel dim. It is sitting down at a table set for one. It is washing clothes that will never again be worn. It is walking into a house that once felt alive, only to realize it has turned into a shell. And so I keep cleaning, because scrubbing and dusting and folding are the only prayers I have left. But deep inside me, beneath the sorrow, something else lingers. A question. A strange unease I can't quite name. As if the silence in this house is hiding more than just the absence of my husband. And though I don't yet know it, my world is about to tilt in a way I never imagined. It happened on a Tuesday morning, one of those gray days when the clouds hang so low. You feel like you could reach up and touch them. I had decided to tackle the attic, a place I had been avoiding for years. Dust thick as flour, boxes stacked like gravestones, and the kind of stillness that makes you hold your breath. I told myself I was being practical, sorting things, maybe giving some to charity, but truthfully I was searching. Not for anything in particular, just for pieces of him. Old photographs, letters, scraps of the life we had built together. If I could gather them around me, maybe the house would feel less empty. I started with the boxes marked in his handwriting, that familiar slant of his letters that always tilted to the right. One said taxes 1974 to 1980, another said insurance, another just miscellaneous. I laughed softly to myself because miscellaneous was his favorite word whenever he didn't want to explain what he'd been doing. I coughed as I pulled a box closer, the dust rising in little clouds. Inside were papers yellowed with age, old bank statements, utility bills, receipts from vacations long past. And at the bottom, tucked between folders, was something I had never seen before. A thin manila envelope with no label. My hand shook as I opened it, though I couldn't have said why. Inside was a stack of neatly folded papers, bound with a red ribbon. That ribbon was the first thing that struck me. Patrick was never sentimental about things like that. He would have stapled them or shoved them in a folder. This ribbon spoke of care, of something kept aside, maybe even hidden. I untied it slowly, as though the knot itself might bite me. The first page was heavy with legal language. Marriage contract. The words seemed to leap off the page, and for a moment I didn't understand. My eyes skimmed quickly, searching for context until I found it. Patrick's name written in that elegant, formal ink, alongside another name I did not recognize at first. A woman's name. My breath caught. I read further, each line pressing down on me like a weight. The contract laid out terms of property and inheritance, and as I followed the cold language, the truth dawned. Upon his death, everything, this estate, the house I was standing in, the land, even the bank accounts, was to be transferred to her. Not to me, not to our children, not to the family we had built, but to a woman whose name now seared itself into my memory. For a long time I sat on the attic floor, the paper trembling in my hands. First I thought there must be some mistake. Perhaps I was misreading it. Perhaps it was an old draft, a business arrangement, something harmless. But the more I read, the clearer it became. This was not business. This was betrayal. The contract was dated only a few years back, long after our children were grown, long after I had spent decades by his side. My Patrick, the man I had cooked for, nursed through illness, laughed with, prayed with, had written a future in which I did not exist. I remember pressing my palm to the floorboards just to keep from fainting. The attic swayed around me, the rafters bending like tree branches in a storm. My lips moved but no sound came out. Her name repeated in my head, sharp as glass. Who was she? How long had she been in his life? Had I been sharing my marriage all these years without knowing? I thought of all the nights he came home late, the weekends he claimed he needed to catch up on paperwork, the secretive phone calls where he spoke in a tone softer than he ever used with me. I had explained them away. Of course I had. That's what wives do when they want to believe. The papers slid from my lap onto the floor, fanning out like fallen leaves. I stared at them, at the cruel neatness of it all. My husband had not only loved another woman, he had promised her everything. I whispered his name then, not in longing but in disbelief. Patrick, how could you? My voice sounded foreign in the emptiness. I thought back to our wedding day, the vows spoken under the white steeple, the ring he slid onto my trembling finger. I had believed every word. I had built a life on those promises. And yet here in black and white was proof that I had been living beside a man who planned for my absence as carefully as one might plan a garden. At some point, I gathered the papers back into the envelope, though my hands shook so badly I could hardly fold them. I pressed the ribbon back around it, as if tying it up could somehow undo what I had read. But nothing could undo it. I carried the envelope downstairs with me, holding it like a cursed object. I set it on the kitchen table and stared at it for hours. The kettle boiled dry on the stove, the clock ticked through the afternoon, and still I sat there, numb, unable to look away. The house, already so cold since his death, seemed to turn to ice around me. The walls no longer held memories, they held lies. I touched the table where we had eaten thousands of meals together, the floor where our children had taken their first steps, the door frame marked with pencil lines of their growing heights. All of it, every corner now felt borrowed. Not mine. Hers. When night fell, I still sat there, the envelope before me. I did not cry. Not yet. The tears were buried too deep. What I felt instead was a hollowing out, a great emptiness where once there had been love. And though I couldn't name it then, another feeling had begun to stir beneath the shock. A flicker of anger, small but sharp, like the first spark of a fire. I don't know how long I sat at that kitchen table, the envelope before me like a silent enemy. Maybe hours, maybe the whole night. The clock's hands turned, but I barely noticed. Every so often, I reached out and touched the paper as if to be sure it was real. Each time I did, the truth cut deeper. Patrick had written me out of his life long before death carried him away. I held the contract in trembling hands, reading it again and again until the words blurred. Property, estate, transfer, all those cold legal terms, but what I saw between the lines was sharper than any blade. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the land. It was my marriage. My decades of loyalty, my faith, my love, reduced to nothing more than a miscalculation in someone else's ledger. Was it all a lie? That question haunted me. I tried to push it away, but it echoed in every corner of my mind. I thought of our wedding day. I had been so young, so full of belief in forever. I wore a simple lace gown borrowed from my cousin, my hair pinned with white flowers from my mother's garden. Patrick's smile when he lifted my veil, that was the smile I carried with me all these years, the one I leaned on during sickness, during lean times, during quarrels. Had that smile already belonged to someone else? I remembered the way he used to slip notes into my apron pocket when I was cooking, little scribbles of affection. "My darling," he'd write, or "Dinner smells wonderful, but you smell sweeter." Had those notes stopped because life got busy, or because he had begun writing them for another woman? The humiliation burned hotter than the grief. I pressed my face into my hands, ashamed even though I had done nothing wrong. How blind I must have been, how foolish. To think I had been the only one. To think that all those nights of waiting at the window, watching for his headlights, meant he was mine. He was never mine, not entirely. I walked through the house like a ghost that morning, touching everything as if it might vanish. His chair in the study, the bed we shared, the dining room where our family had celebrated every Thanksgiving. Each object whispered betrayal, and each whisper cracked something inside me. I sat in silence, clutching the paper, the anger and the sorrow wrestling inside me until I could hardly breathe. My hands trembled, not from age this time but from rage. How dare he? How dare he take my years, my loyalty, my very life, and hand it all away with the stroke of a pen. The past came flooding back with new eyes. That business trip he took the year our youngest left for college, was it really business? Or was it her? The perfume I once smelled faintly on his collar, the one he laughed off as just from the secretary's office, was it hers? Every unexplained expense, every guarded phone call, every time he came home late with a flimsy excuse, suddenly it all lined up in a way I had never dared imagine. I pressed the paper to my chest, rocking back and forth like a woman who'd lost her mind. Part of me wished I could tear it into shreds, scatter it to the wind, pretend it never existed. But another part, stronger, colder, knew I could not. This was not just paper. This was proof. And proof had power. But in that moment I wasn't strong enough to think about power. I was only a woman broken open, my illusions shattered. I thought of the years I had given him, cooking his meals, ironing his shirts, nursing him through fevers, forgiving him when he was sharp with me. I thought of the sacrifices, the jobs I turned down, the friends I lost touch with, the hobbies I abandoned, all because he came first. And in the end, all that devotion was worth less than the signature on this cursed contract. I cried then. Not soft tears, but the kind that hollow you out, leaving you weak and shaking. The sobs tore from me in great heaving waves. My body bent over the table as though the grief itself was trying to break me. When the tears slowed, anger returned sharper than before. I lifted my head, staring out the kitchen window at the garden where the roses grew wild. I remembered planting those roses with him, our hands covered in dirt, our laughter filling the air. He had kissed me then, dirt smudged on his cheek, and said, "These roses will be here long after we're gone, a piece of us living on." But there was no us. Was there? There had been me. And her. And a man who had split himself between two worlds, leaving me with the scraps. I whispered aloud, though no one was there to hear me, "I will not be erased." The words startled me, but once spoken they rang true. Yes, I was grieving. Yes, I was humiliated. But I was not gone. I was still here. And if Patrick thought he could silence me with this contract, he had forgotten the kind of woman he had married. The paper still lay before me, its edges curling slightly where my tears had fallen. I pressed it flat, smoothed it with my hand, and tucked it back into the envelope. I would keep it safe. Not as a memory, not as a wound, but as a weapon. The house was still cold, still foreign, but something had shifted in me. Beneath the grief, beneath the sorrow, something stronger was taking root. He had betrayed me. He had humiliated me. But I would not let him or her have the final word. Not yet. It was only a few days after I found the contract when she came. The air was heavy that morning, thick with the smell of rain. I had been sitting in the parlor with a cup of tea gone cold, the envelope still on the mantel where I kept staring at it like it might burst into flames. That's when the sound of tires crunched down the gravel drive. Not a neighbor, not a delivery. No one drove up here unannounced. I pulled back the curtain and there she was, stepping out of a sleek black car, her heels clicking against the stones as if she owned every one of them. She was tall, elegant, her hair twisted up in a style I could never have managed, her coat tailored perfectly to her frame. She didn't glance at the house with reverence or memory. She looked at it the way one might look at merchandise in a shop window. I froze, my hand still on the curtain. A part of me knew who she was before she even spoke. The knock came sharp, decisive, like a judge's gavel. When I opened the door she smiled, though it wasn't warmth. It was victory. "You must be Eleanor," she said smoothly, as though greeting a stranger. Her voice was sweetened with false pity, the kind you'd use with a child who doesn't yet know the rules of the world. I didn't answer right away. I stood there, my heart pounding, gripping the edge of the door until my knuckles went white. Finally I managed, "And you are." She didn't flinch. "The rightful owner of this estate." The words sliced through me like ice. She said them with such calm certainty, as though my entire life could be brushed aside by her tongue. Before I could respond, she stepped past me into the hall, her perfume filling the space where his scent used to linger. She looked around, nodding slightly as though taking inventory. My home, the rooms where I raised children, where I cooked meals, where I prayed during long nights, reduced to a property tour. I found my voice then. This is my home. She turned, tilting her head, the corners of her lips curving in something close to a laugh. It was. But Patrick saw fit to ensure it would pass into capable hands. Capable hands. That's what she called herself. As if all my years of keeping this house, of tending this land, of pouring myself into every corner of it, counted for nothing. The next moment is burned into me. She gestured toward the front door, and two men appeared from her car. Movers. They carried boxes already prepared, as if she had known I would not leave willingly. Within minutes, my belongings, my life, were being carried out and set down on the doorstep. My photo albums, my blankets, the dishes my mother had given me. One by one, they were piled outside like discarded trash. Take only what you can carry, she said coolly, watching from the doorway. The rest stays. I stood there helpless, clutching the banister for strength, watching my life be stripped away piece by piece. When one of the men set down the quilt I had stitched the year our first child was born, I almost lunged for it, but I forced myself to stay still. I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me beg. At last, when the last of my things had been dumped on the steps, she stepped forward. Her heels clicked against the wood, each sound hammering into my chest. She leaned close, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for me. Go report it if you like. But don't come back here again. I don't want to see you on these grounds. It's all mine now. Her eyes glittered, not with kindness but with triumph. Then she straightened, smoothed her coat, and turned back inside. The door shut firmly, the sound echoing through me like thunder. I stood there on the porch, surrounded by the wreckage of my own life, the rain beginning to fall. My suitcase, my photographs, my quilts, all of it dampened by the weather, while behind that closed door she walked across the floors I had polished, gazed through the windows I had washed, and claimed the walls that had heard my laughter and tears. For a moment I thought I might collapse right there on the steps. My knees trembled, my breath came shallow. I had lost Patrick, and now I had lost the very home we had built together. But even in that moment of deepest despair, as the rain soaked through my coat and my belongings lay scattered around me, something else stirred in me. The humiliation cut deep. The grief clawed at me. But beneath it all, faint and steady, was a spark. A whisper inside me said, "This is not the end." The rain didn't let up as I stood there on the porch, my things piled at my feet. I must have looked like a beggar in front of my own house, the house I had scrubbed, polished, and poured my soul into for more than 40 years. Every board, every nail, every garden bed outside held a memory, and now I was a trespasser. I bent slowly, my back aching, to gather what I could. My old suitcase, the one Patrick and I had taken on our honeymoon to Niagara Falls, was still sturdy enough to hold a few clothes. I tucked the quilt inside, the one stitched with the names of our children embroidered along the border. Beside it, I placed a tin box of photographs, their edges already curling with damp. That was all I could carry. Just fragments of a life, chosen in haste while my heart cracked inside me. The rest I left behind. My dishes, my books, the rocking chair where I had nursed babies and rocked them to sleep, left to her. It felt like leaving pieces of myself behind, like tearing skin from bone. But the woman had made it clear. I was no longer welcome. I pulled the suitcase down the steps, each one heavier than the last. By the time I reached the road, I was soaked through. The gravel clung to my shoes, the rain plastered my hair to my face, but I kept moving. One foot in front of the other because if I stopped I feared I'd crumble there on the spot. Neighbors must have seen me, but no one came out. Perhaps they didn't want to get involved, Or perhaps they believed the story she'd already begun to weave, that I had no claim here, that I was nothing more than an old widow clinging to what wasn't hers. Gossip spreads fast in towns like ours, and sympathy even faster turns to silence. At the edge of the property, I turned once more to look at the house. My house. The shutters rattled in the storm, the roses bent low under the weight of the rain, and behind the curtains, I imagined her silhouette moving through the rooms I had once filled with laughter and warmth. It wasn't just a home she had taken. It was my work, my sacrifices, my story. All those years of cooking meals, paying bills, tending gardens, making a house into a home, that was the part that cut the deepest. I had poured myself into those walls until they seemed to breathe with me. And now, standing out in the rain, I realized the house no longer knew my name. I walked to the bus stop at the corner of the road, suitcase dragging behind me, its wheels catching on the stones. I had no plan, no destination. The truth of it was I had nowhere to go. I had always believed this house would be my final resting place, the anchor to all the drifting years of life. To be cast out of it felt like being set adrift on open water, no land in sight. When the bus arrived, I climbed aboard, dripping rain onto the aisle. The driver glanced at me with pity but said nothing. I sank into a seat near the back, hugging the suitcase to my chest like a child. The windows fogged with steam, and through the blur I watched the only home I'd ever known vanish into the distance. Tears came again, not the heaving sobs of before, but quiet ones slipping down my cheeks unchecked. I felt abandoned, not only by Patrick, not only by her, but by life itself. I had given everything I had to my marriage, to that house, to the family we had built, and in return I was left with a single suitcase and an empty future. But beneath the despair, something else stirred, faint but steady. A flicker of determination. I pressed my palm against the cool glass of the bus window, watching the rain streak downward. No, I whispered to myself. This is not how it ends. I didn't know yet how I would fight back. I didn't know where I would find the strength. But I knew one thing for certain. I would not be erased. Not by Patrick's betrayal, not by that woman's cruelty, not by the lies written on that contract. The road stretched on before me, uncertain and dark. But somewhere deep inside a spark was glowing. And though my body was weary, though my spirit was bruised, I clung to that spark as though it were a lantern in the storm. For the first time since Patrick's death, I wasn't just grieving. I was preparing. And one day soon I would return. When I first left the house, I thought I'd never have the strength to face what had been done to me. But the longer I sat alone in that little rented room, the kind with thin curtains that never quite shut out the streetlights, the more a single thought took hold. I need to know the truth. It wasn't enough to grieve. It wasn't enough to rage. I needed to understand who she was, the woman who marched into my home like it had always belonged to her, and what else Patrick had been hiding from me. Because if he had lied about this, what other lies had he buried in the folds of our marriage? So, I found myself doing something I never imagined I'd do, hiring a detective. His name was Mr. Harris, a wiry man with sharp eyes that seemed to read a person before they even opened their mouth. He worked out of a modest office above a pawn shop, the kind of place most women of my age and background would have avoided for fear of scandal. But I had lost my fear of scandal the moment my belongings had been tossed onto my own doorstep. I told him everything about the contract, about the mistress, about being cast out of my home. His face remained unreadable, but when I finished, he leaned back in his chair, tapped his pen against the desk and said simply, "You were right to come to me." Within a week, he began bringing me pieces of the truth. The woman, Margaret, her name was no stranger to this sort of arrangement. Harris showed me papers, photographs, even whispers from people who'd known her before. She had a history, a trail of wealthy men whose lives had unraveled once she appeared. Affairs, secret contracts, inheritances that slipped neatly into her hands. And each time she vanished again, her pockets full and her name carefully scrubbed from polite company. My heart pounded as I listened. To think that the woman who had strutted into my home with such arrogance was nothing more than a parasite, feeding on men like Patrick. And yet what stung worse was realizing that Patrick, my husband, had welcomed her, had chosen her, had signed away everything for her. Harris didn't stop there. He dug deeper into Patrick's past, and what he uncovered was a knife to the gut. Margaret had not been the first. There had been others. Women I had never known about, women whose names had never crossed my ears, but whose shadows had lingered in my marriage nonetheless. Some of the affairs stretched back decades. Some had ended quickly, others had lingered. He had been unfaithful long before his health failed, long before I sat by his hospital bed spooning broth into his mouth and holding his hand through the long nights. I remember sitting in Harris's office, staring at the photographs spread across the desk. Women smiling, women standing beside him at dinners, women whose letters had been found tucked away in his papers. Each face was another betrayal, another stone added to the weight pressing down on my chest. He lived two lives, Harris said quietly. The one you shared, and the one he kept hidden. I closed my eyes then, trying to remember the man I thought I knew. His laughter, his touch, the way he looked at me across the dinner table. Were those moments lies too? Or had he simply been a man who could love and betray in the same breath? I wanted to scream, to tear up the photographs, to banish every memory of him. But I didn't. Instead, I gathered the papers carefully, as though they were weapons. Because that's what they had become. Proof. Proof that he had lied. Proof that she was not some innocent widow stepping into her rightful inheritance, but a woman who had schemed and clawed her way into my life. That night, back in my small rented room, I spread everything out on the bed. The contract, the photographs, the notes Harris had written. I studied them by the weak light of a single lamp, my hands shaking but steady enough to turn each page. For the first time since Patrick's death, I felt something other than grief. I felt clarity. Yes, he had betrayed me. Yes, she had humiliated me. But the truth was now in my hands, and with it came a strange sense of power. I whispered aloud as though speaking to him across the years. You thought you could leave me with nothing. But you've left me with enough. The fire inside me grew stronger that night. No longer was I just a widow cast out. No longer was I a woman left weeping on the doorstep. I was something else now. A fighter. And I would fight with everything I had left. There comes a moment in every storm when the thunder quiets, and you hear only the steady drip of rain. That's what it felt like in the days after Harris handed me the truth of my husband's betrayals. The initial thunder, shock, grief, humiliation had passed. What remained was something quieter but stronger, a resolve that hummed deep in my bones. I had spent too many nights weeping into my hands, too many mornings staring blankly at the wall of that rented room. But when I looked at those photographs, those contracts, those names of women I'd never known, a voice inside me grew louder. No more. For decades I had been the quiet, dutiful wife. I cooked meals, raised children, tended the house, kept the peace. I smoothed over his moods, forgave his absences, and filled the silence with my own love. But what had that bought me? Betrayal. A contract written to erase me. My belongings dumped on the porch like rubbish. I wasn't about to spend the rest of my days in some little apartment, knitting in silence while another woman slept beneath my roof. No, if Patrick and his mistress thought they could write me out of the story, they had underestimated the kind of woman I had become. I stood in front of the mirror one morning, brushing out my silver hair, and I hardly recognized the woman staring back. Not because of the lines around my eyes or the tiredness in my cheeks, but because of the steel I saw there. I was no longer just a grieving widow. I was a woman with a purpose. I thought of my mother who used to tell me, Eleanor, when life pushes you into a corner, you don't curl up, you sharpen your elbows. Well, my elbows had been sharpened, and I was ready to use them. The first step was simple: stop hiding. For too long I'd been walking the streets like a shadow, afraid of what people might whisper. But the whispers no longer mattered. Let them talk. Let them wonder. The truth was mine now, and I was going to wield it. I went to see Harris again. He raised an eyebrow when I walked in, standing taller than I had before. "You're not broken anymore," he said quietly. "Broken?" I smiled coldly. "No. I'm burning, and I'm going to use that fire." We laid out a plan. He had given me evidence, but evidence was nothing without action. Lawyers would need to see it, the courts would need to hear it. And so I began knocking on doors I never thought I'd approach. Law firms with brass plaques and polished floors. Men in suits who tried at first to dismiss me as just another bitter widow. But I didn't let them. I laid out the contract, the photographs, the trail of deceit. I spoke calmly, but with a steel edge, and I saw the shift in their faces. I was no fool. I had been wronged, and the law, however slow, however tangled, was a weapon I intended to use. At night, when exhaustion pressed on me, I lit a single candle by the window and whispered to myself, "You are not finished." Those words became my prayer, my battle cry. Even in my solitude, I felt Patrick's ghost. Not the loving husband I had once believed in, but the shadow of the man who thought he could betray me quietly and be remembered fondly. I spoke to that ghost sometimes, my voice low but steady. "You thought I was weak. You thought I'd roll over and fade away. But you were wrong. I will not be erased. Not by you, and certainly not by her." The more I said it, the more it became truth. Every betrayal Harris had uncovered became fuel. Every cruel word from Margaret when she cast me out became kindling. The fire inside me grew, not wild and uncontrolled, but steady and consuming. I began keeping a notebook, my war book, I called it. In it, I wrote down everything I remembered. Every suspicious absence. Every detail Harris found. Every slight. Every humiliation. Every lie. Page after page until my hand cramped. Not because I wanted to drown in the past, but because I intended to lay it bare when the time came. And the time would come. I was not the same woman who sat on the porch weeping as rain fell on her belongings. That woman was gone. What remained was someone my husband and his mistress had never counted on. A fighter, sharpened by pain, steady with purpose. I no longer feared the silence of the little rented room. It was no longer exile, it was preparation. A place where I gathered my strength, sharpened my resolve, and waited for the moment to strike. The fire in me was no longer just a spark. It was a steady flame, one I would carry into the halls of justice. And I swore to myself as I closed my notebook one night and blew out the candle. They may have tried to take my home. They may have tried to erase my name. But before this is over, the world will know the truth. And I will walk through those doors again, not as a stranger, but as the rightful mistress of my house. I had always believed arrogance was its own undoing, and Margaret proved me right. She may have strutted into my home with contracts and movers, but what she lacked was patience. The kind of patience it takes to truly hold on to something. You see, she thought possession was the same as ownership. She thought walking across my floors in her high-heeled shoes made her queen. But the house had a way of showing its disapproval. It began small. Harris told me first because neighbors whispered to him before they dared whisper to me. "She's selling things," he said, laying a photograph on the table between us. And there it was. My parlor, stripped bare of the grandfather clock that had stood in the corner since my parents gave it to us as a wedding gift. The clock I had polished, wound, and listened to through sleepless nights. Sold off just like that. Soon it wasn't just the clock. The dining table, where every holiday had been celebrated, was carted away by dealers. My grandmother's china gone. Even the old portraits, faces of family who had stood on that land for generations, disappeared one by one. She thinks it's hers to do with as she likes, Harris said grimly. But I knew better. What she was really doing was showing the world her greed. A true mistress of a house doesn't strip it bare. A true mistress cares for its history, its soul. Margaret had no sense of that. She wanted money, she wanted change, she wanted to put her mark on everything. I heard from a neighbor one morning, a woman I had known since my children were little. She leaned close, whispering as if we were schoolgirls sharing a secret. She's tearing down the rose garden. My heart stilled. Those roses, Patrick and I had planted them in our first years of marriage. Every thorn, every bloom was tied to memory. To rip them up was to rip up the very roots of our life together. But Margaret didn't care. Within days the soil was bare, ready for some fashionable landscaping from a glossy magazine. The neighbors saw. They talked. Whispers spread like vines. She has no respect for tradition. She doesn't understand the house. She doesn't belong there. And the more she pushed her changes, the louder those whispers grew. I meanwhile kept quiet. That was my strength. While she flaunted, I observed. While she boasted, I prepared. Harris and I collected every story, every bill of sale, every neighbor's testimony. Piece by piece, her recklessness was building my case for me. One evening, Harris placed another folder in my hands. "She's remodeling," he said. "Without permits." I flipped through the papers, photographs of half-torn walls, antique wood carted out and replaced with cheap modern plaster. The library, once lined with books Patrick and I had gathered over a lifetime, was stripped bare, the shelves demolished. I didn't cry. Not anymore. I sat there, my back straight, my lips pressed tight, and I said softly, "She's handing me the rope with which to hang her." Harris gave a rare smile. "Exactly." Neighbors began coming to me quietly, one by one. Some left notes slipped under my door. Some spoke in hushed tones at the market. "We don't approve of what she's doing," they'd say. "It doesn't feel right." Their sympathy, once withheld, now returned. Not because they suddenly cared more for me, but because they saw her stripping away the very heart of the estate. People will forgive many things, but not the destruction of what they consider sacred. And all the while, Margaret paraded about, acting as though she was untouchable. She hosted dinners, inviting strangers to rooms where I had once read bedtime stories to my children. She boasted about renovations, laughing as she described how outdated my touch had been. But arrogance is blind. She didn't see that her actions were sowing seeds of doubt in every witness who might stand in court. She didn't realize that every reckless decision was another stone in the wall I was building against her. Late one night, I walked past the estate, standing at the edge of the road like a thief returning to her treasure. The windows glowed with light, voices drifted on the night air. And then I saw it, furniture being carried out, loaded onto a truck. My husband's desk, the one where he signed every letter, every bill, every check. The desk where we planned our future. I stood very still, the cold air biting my skin, and I whispered, "Go on, Margaret. Dig your own grave." Because by then, the fire in me had become something unshakable. I wasn't only determined to fight. I was waiting, patient as stone, knowing her arrogance would destroy her long before I laid down my evidence in front of a judge. And I swore, as I turned away from that glowing house that had once been mine, when I walk back through those doors, it will not be as a guest or a beggar. It will be as the rightful mistress. And she will be nothing more than a shadow that passed through. The courthouse smelled of old paper and polish, the kind of place where time itself seemed to sit heavy in the walls. I had never imagined myself there, not as anything more than a juror once or twice in my younger days. But now I walked through those tall wooden doors with my head high, carrying the weight of my life in a leather folder clutched to my chest. Margaret was already there, of course. She sat near the front, dressed to the nines in a silk suit, her hair done up as though she were attending an opera instead of a trial. When our eyes met, she smiled that same cold smile she'd given me on the porch. It was meant to intimidate, to remind me of the day she tossed my belongings out like refuse. But I didn't flinch. Not this time. My lawyers, 2 men Harris had recommended, rose to speak. They were younger than me by decades but sharp as knives. They laid out the contract first, that cursed document with Patrick's name and hers scrawled across it. Margaret's lawyer smirked, as though the thing itself was a coffin for me. But then my lawyers began pulling at the threads. Mistakes. That was the word they used again and again. Mistakes in the wording, mistakes in the dates, mistakes in the notarization. Patrick and Margaret, in their arrogance, had drawn up a contract full of holes. Holes my lawyers drove wedges into until the whole thing began to tear apart at the seams. Then came Harris's work. One by one, photographs and testimonies were presented. Neighbors spoke of family heirlooms sold, of roses torn out by the roots, of reckless remodeling done without permits. Margaret shifted in her chair, her painted lips tightening as the whisper spread across the courtroom. She had overplayed her hand, and now the record of it was being read aloud for all to hear. And then came the part that silenced even her. Harris revealed the history she had hoped to keep hidden. The men before Patrick, the inheritances that had mysteriously shifted into her name, the lives she had left in tatters. Each revelation was a stone dropped into the still air of the courtroom. I watched the judge's eyes narrow, the jurors exchange uneasy glances. Margaret's face, once smug, grew pale under her rouge. I sat very still through it all, my hands folded neatly in my lap. Not once did I let my anger show. It wasn't anger they needed to see. It was dignity. The dignity of a woman who had been betrayed, humiliated, cast out, but who had risen anyway. When Margaret's lawyer tried to paint me as bitter, as vengeful, as a confused old widow who didn't understand what she was reading, I lifted my chin and spoke clearly for the first time. I know what I read. I know what my husband signed. And I know what this woman has done, not just to me but to others. I gave my life to that estate, to that home, to my marriage. I will not be erased from it. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. The judge cleared his throat, shuffled the papers, and at last delivered the words I had been waiting for. The contract is invalid. It was as though the very air rushed back into my lungs. Invalid. The estate was restored to me. The house, the land, the name that had been nearly stolen, all of it returned. Margaret sat frozen, her lawyer whispering furiously in her ear. But the fight was over. Her arrogance had undone her, and the truth had set me free. I rose slowly, my knees stiff but steady, and walked out of that courtroom with my head higher than it had been in years. Behind me, Margaret's voice hissed in sharp whispers, but I didn't turn back. She was already fading, a shadow, just as I had promised myself she would be. For the first time since Patrick's death, I felt the ground solid beneath my feet. The battle was done. The home was mine again. And though I had lost a husband, I had regained something far greater. My dignity. The day I returned to the estate, the air was bright and cool, the kind of morning that carried the scent of promise. The gates creaked as I pushed them open, and for a moment, I just stood there at the edge of the drive, staring up at the house. My house. It looked different than when I'd left. Some of Margaret's gaudy touches still clung to it, garish curtains in the front windows, a garland of lights strung across the porch like some cheap celebration. But beneath it all I could still see the bones of home. The shutters I had painted with Patrick years ago. The bricks laid by hands I knew. The garden soil where roses had once thrived. I carried no suitcase this time. No heavy burden of grief or humiliation. I carried only a single key, pressed warm in my palm, returned to me by the court. When I stepped across the threshold, the silence was waiting. But it was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of loss. This silence felt different, like a clean slate, a chance to breathe new life into old walls. I wandered slowly from room to room, my hand brushing along the woodwork. The parlor was bare where the grandfather clock had stood, but I promised myself I would find another, something that carried the same steady tick of belonging. The dining room echoed without its table, yet I could already see family gathered there again, laughter filling the emptiness. And the library, stripped of shelves gutted by Margaret's carelessness, brought the sharpest ache. But even there I smiled faintly. She had thought tearing it down would erase me. Instead, it gave me the gift of rebuilding. My hands, my choices, my history woven back into every corner. I climbed the stairs slowly, my knees stiff, until I reached the bedroom. The bedspread was unfamiliar, something she must have chosen, but the shape of the room was still ours. I sat on the edge of the mattress and let out a long breath. This was where I had reached for Patrick in the dark, where I had whispered prayers in the night, where I had first felt the hollow absence of betrayal. And yet, sitting there now, I felt something new. Not grief, not rage, but strength. I had lost his loyalty long ago, though I hadn't known it. But what I had reclaimed was far greater. My name, my dignity, my place. As I rose and opened the window, the breeze carried the faint scent of earth. I imagined roses blooming again, their roots deep, their petals defiant. Yes, the house had been broken just as I had. But both of us had endured. Both of us had been restored. I stood in the doorway of my home, and whispered softly into the quiet. I am here, and I am not erased. My dears, if in this story you saw yourselves, be sure to write about it in the comments. I would be very interested to read it. Thank you.